Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Conversations in Black Studies, sponsored by the program in African American Studies at Wake Forest University. My name is Corey Walker. I'm the Wake Forest Professor of the Humanities and Director of African American Studies. This series of curated public conversations examines some of the key issues and ideas in the discipline of African American Studies. Conversations in Black Studies invite students, scholars, activists, and the community to engage some of the historic and contemporary questions animating this discipline in the hopes of creating new knowledge grounded in the critical and comprehensive study of the peoples, cultures, and ideas and expressions of continental and diasporic Africans across space and time. Tonight, we have a very special guest, a wonderful and longtime friend, Dr. Keisha-Khan Perry. In an essay entitled The Groundings with My Sisters, Toward a Black Feminist Agenda in the Americas, Dr. Perry opens up that essay with these words: "The extent to which July 25th, the day of the Black woman in Latin America and the Caribbean, has been celebrated since its creation in 1992 is difficult to document. Rarely is the date or its significance mentioned. And I am doubtful that state recognition of Black women's labor, politics, and culture is possible given that many Latin American expressions of public pride and Black womanhood conjure up images of political subalternity, of feminist solidarity located on the fringes of Black activism, and of desires of geographically boundless human dignities emerging from revolutionary ideals instead of the everyday realities of African-descended women. This essay is an attempt to reverse this tendency by restoring, rather than diminishing, the transnational Black feminist possibilities in the Americas. In many ways, the words that open up her essay elegantly capture the critical intellectual practice and proud embracing political vision of Professor Perry. Keisha-Khan Perry is the Presidential Penn Compact Associate Professor of Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, where she specializes in race, gender, and politics in the Americas, urban geography and questions of citizenship, intellectual history and disciplinary formation, and the interrelationship between scholarship, pedagogy, and political engagement. She has conducted extensive research in Argentina, Belize, Brazil, Ecuador, Mexico, and the United States. Her first book, Black Women Against the Land Grab, The Fight for Racial Justice in Brazil, is an ethnographic study of Black women's activism in Brazilian cities, specifically an examination of Black women's participation in leadership in neighborhood associations and the reinterpretations of racial and gender identities in urban spaces. The book is the result of more than a decade of research collaborations with local activists in the Gamboa de Baixo, also called Gamboa neighborhood of the city of Salvador, that is at the heart of the work. The winner of the National Women's Studies Association 2014 Gloria E. Anzaldúa Book Award, this book includes an analysis of the relationship between violent state policing and mass evictions, as well as between environmental justice movements and land and housing rights struggles in Brazil. She is currently writing a book that follows up on her experiences in writing Black Women Against the Land Grab with a project entitled Anthropology for Liberation. This book draws heavily on her ethnographic research experience in Brazil, with an emphasis on the complexity of doing activist research amidst racial and gender violence. Her next project, most recent extensive book-length project, is The Historical Paradox of Citizenship, Black Land Ownership and Loss in the Americas. This is a continuation of the research themes explored in Black Women Against the Land Grab, but it extends and documents and analyzes the political paradox of Black land loss and ownership in relation to the material articulations of citizenship in Brazil, the United States, and in Jamaica. Her work has won numerous awards, and she's an award-winning professor and teacher and graduate student mentor, and her research has been supported by fellowships from the National Science Foundation, Fulbright Fellowship, the Pembroke Center for Women, the Pembroke Center for the Study of Women, along with the Watson Center for Public and International Affairs. Welcome, Professor Keisha-Khan Perry. Thank you, Keisha-Khan, for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Professor Walker, for having me participate in these conversations in Black Studies at Wake Forest University. I'm delighted to participate and hear from our audience. Only you could convince me to do something on a Sunday night at 7 o'clock, but this is really important. So buenas noches. And there are some really important people in terms of my own research trajectory that I have to acknowledge that's on the call. Professor Sheila Walker, an important, I'll talk more about that in a little bit, but certainly I have to acknowledge folks like her who were really, who I deeply admired from the very beginning and who I modeled my own career after, so yeah.
Well, Keisha-Khan, these conversations are designed to go along with our Introduction to African American Studies class. And we've been spending some great amount of time on the concept of diaspora and making sure that when we think of the field of Black studies, when we think of the discipline of African American studies, it is always around continental and diasporic Africans, whether those diasporic Africans are in the US, Brazil, the Caribbean, the internal diasporas of Africa, Europe, across the world. Talk to us a bit about your intellectual journey to Black studies and your vision as an Africana studies scholar.
Such an important question. I have to begin by acknowledging that I'm an immigrant in this country. I was born in Jamaica. I came as a preteen, about the same age that my son is right now, almost 11. So I would say that my own kind of early intellectual journeys kind of begin in diaspora in terms of diasporic movement from the Caribbean to the United States. And I think my first introduction to African American life was through the AME Church in a small town in New Jersey where my mother decided to settle. So initially, I would say much of my knowledge of African American history came through the AME Church and being active in the youth organization of that particular church and community over several years. So there's that. I would say that at some point, my own mother, because of her own educational journeys, led me to, she attended a community college in New Jersey. Then she went to Rutgers. She worked with Lennox Hines, who was the attorney for Sata Shakur. I remember sitting in his classes in the back and carrying her bags. And then he encouraged her to go to law school. So we moved to Newark, and living in Newark also was really, I would say, life changing in terms of how impactful that experience was in terms of being in a true diasporic Black city in the United States and being surrounded by so many peoples of African descent from all over the world. And I would say, and I have to kind of lift up Melissa Cooper, who was a professor of history at the University of, at Rutgers University in Newark, but she and I actually went to high school together. So I think these were some of the early conversations about the Black world were taking place, right? And watching Eyes on the Prize in its entirety, and giving me a completely different introduction to African American history, as well as the global Black world. From there, I went to college at Georgetown, studied Spanish and Latin American literature, with the explicit aim of probably going into language interpretation or going on to study Latin American literature at the graduate level. That took me to Latin America and to Argentina specifically. Then I went to Brazil. And during those particular trips or study abroad experiences, I would say that I was introduced to mass movements, popular movements, as well as guerrilla movements, which is what I wrote my undergraduate thesis on. So I would say it's a long journey to Black studies, but I would say what was really impactful for me during one of my journeys to Brazil was a trip to Salvador, where I literally had a moment where I couldn't figure out where I was. Like I was like kind of in diaspora, where I was this African-American, Jamaican-born African-American woman standing on the streets of Salvador. And I felt like I was in Jamaica. I felt like I was in a place how I'd imagined West Africa. And all of that I ever learned about Bahia and the place of the formation of the diaspora, I was feeling it in that moment. And that's one of the main reasons why I decided to return to Brazil after graduation from college, to live there. And that's how I met activists. And I read more about folks who were writing about Brazil. And actually I was introduced to Sheila Walker's essays on, for example, the Irmandade da Boa Morte before I started graduate studies. And it was really one of the decisions, important decisions I made in attending the University of Texas at Austin, where she had led the building of one of the largest kind of the African Diaspora Studies program in anthropology, right? And at that point, there were about 5 professors there: Edmund T. Gordon, I think later on, it was Maria Franklin, Asili Angela Johnny, who brought me there and developed and helped me develop a language for understanding what I had seen in Brazil, experienced in Brazil, and my own kind of personal and intellectual background in Jamaica and traveling around the Americas. So I would say that's my early, I would say it's no accident that the anthropologists at the University of Texas were the ones who helped to construct and build Black studies at the University of Texas. So I would say that's my early introduction to Black studies. Maybe I could say our struggles over African-American literature at Georgetown may have been part of that early work with Kim Hall as my professor. But I would say that being deeply entrenched with scholars who were doing work all over the Americas and bringing together experiences from Africa and the African diaspora in the Americas and making those questions and diasporic movement and politics central to what became the Austin School, I think were really foundational long before I even got to Brown and was introduced to folks like you. So I would say my general quick introduction would be that. It's a long, I could talk more about whatever aspect of that you would like for me to talk about, but I would say the University of Texas at Austin was important, and my early travels to Latin America and especially Argentina and Brazil were extremely important to my intellectual formation and how I got to African-American studies, Black studies, and deeply entrenched in a global perspective in the discipline.
You talk about your experiences and your formative and the ways of you've been shaped, not only your personal experiences moving from Jamaica to the US, your experiences in New Jersey with your mother, and those educational experiences, as well as political experiences, those formative experiences at Georgetown and at UT Austin. But more importantly, your experiences in Mexico and Argentina and in Brazil. Talk to us a bit about how the centrality of diaspora, both as a concept, as a practice, really animates. How does it animate your intellectual agenda and your research vision?
The concept of diaspora became really important in how I understood myself in the world as being African in the Americas. And I think I always understood myself as being African, Black and African in America. And I would like to say that I always thought much about how my, not just in terms of an ancestral connection to the African continent, but really how we were moving around the world and were deeply connected. And I think it's and I would say that I'd give you an example. When I was studying abroad in Argentina, I decided to travel to South Africa. And I was one of the first moments where I could really fully, and I was, in essence, through travel, searching for someplace else, or trying to understand where else could we go, outside of North America. And I remember being in South Africa and crying for the 2 weeks that I was there and realizing, wow, and someone telling me that it was going to take 100 years to undo apartheid. And I think for me, what that meant is just how deeply connected we are as a people in terms of experiences with racial oppression, et cetera. So, and I think that fundamental understanding of our experience with racial violence, I think really defines diaspora, but so does a politics of liberation also define our experiences in diaspora, right? So this idea, I think for me, diaspora is an identity in terms of how I understand myself in the world, acknowledging a deep history tied to African and forced migration and enslavement, plantation slavery, and continued forms of intersectional oppressions in societies in which we live. But so does a political, the politics of in terms of liberation struggles that people are fighting throughout the world and how they're deeply connected, whether it be on the African continent, the struggles for land there, and what has, what's taking place in terms of Black power and civil rights struggles in the United States and elsewhere. So I would say for me, if I would drawing from even the Austin School Manifesto, which is a recommended reading, I think it's an identity, but it's also a politics and a way of centering how we move through the world and are always engaged in struggle, right? So I would say that it's not just about like a cyclic return. It's about, these connections and, really recognizing the depth of our histories and knowledges and where we come from and the ideas that have been formed over centuries, right? So I think that's how I think about diaspora. I think it's a deeply political term in terms of how we understand our global Black community.
You really highlight and underscore the political dimensions of diaspora, not only inclusive of the ways in which it imagines a global African community, and the ways in which it animates certain formations of memory, as well as certain formations of how we think of history and the global intellectual project of producing and reproducing certain critical knowledges. Your underscoring of that political dimension really animates the way in which you approach Black feminism. Talk to us a bit about your approach to Black feminism and transnational Black feminism informed by this vision of diaspora, this political vision of diaspora.
Mm-hmm. I just saw today a photograph of Audre Lorde sitting in Berlin, and it was so striking to me for some reason. I was thinking that, wow, I hadn't seen that, and she was wearing African clothes, right? And I just can imagine the kinds of conversations that, she was having during her travels, and how important diaspora and diasporic movement, and, whether it be from, in terms of, I think part of a lot of my intellectual work has been about how Black women have always traveled and moved about the world and shared experiences and knowledges. And I think about, for example, Ida B. Wells and how significant it was for her to travel, and spread the word of the anti-lynching campaign in America, and Claudia Jones, and among Islanda Robeson, among numerous others, right? So I think a lot of my early work, and I want to credit always Kim Hall, Professor Kim Hall, who was my Intro to Women's Studies professor at Georgetown. And I would say I credit her for really pushing me in the direction of feminist studies. I grew up in a feminist household, but in terms of intellectual traditions, I would say it started at Georgetown. And I would say that a lot of what she introduced me to in class, and later on, I think in graduate studies, Aseli Angela Johnny as well, was really about thinking how our experiences were profoundly connected, right? So I would say, in terms of I came to Black feminism through the academy in terms of particular ideas around intersectionality and Black. Sorry, I was a little bit distracted. My son came to get something in the kitchen, of course. So I would say that that's how I was introduced to Black feminism and thinking about global struggles as women, and particularly how women were traveling to make those connections. I would say that another important intervention for me, which is where I realize every now and again, I realize, wow, I didn't realize this was key in some ways, is how working in a grassroots organization in Bahia, and I've written about this, became one of the most important Black feminist classrooms for me, right? So these were women who were mostly not formally educated and were teaching me about just racial politics, gender politics, sexuality, et cetera, and how that is, those ideas and identities are deeply linked to struggles over material resources such as clean water, land. And I think they were the ones who led me into, I would say, a Black left kind of materialist feminist approach to doing my work, right? Where women focus not just in terms on gender and sexual empowerment and class empowerment, but certainly how they could access and read, and in terms of democratize the resources that are available in society, right? So I would say I deeply indebted to the Black feminist classrooms of the Academy in the United States, but I would say social movements are where I learned much of my critiques of racial capitalism, much of my critiques of how gender and sexuality works in society. Right, so I'll just stop there.
You really you highlight the ways in which your work in Brazil sort of animated those tendencies of Black feminist life that you've experienced, not only formally in the academy, but the ways in which you were growing up with your mother, the ways in which you were raised in New Jersey. In many ways, the academy provided you with the language and categories, but there was always those practices that were always there. And then when you go and you write your book, Black Women Against the Land Grab, you find that these classrooms deepen that knowledge. Absolutely. Talk to us a bit about the ways in which the classroom in Salvador, those Black feminist lessons and practices really animate and deepen that the ideas around Black feminism and the ways in which transnational Black feminism connects us in some deep, in some profound and deeply political and consequential ways.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting. Today I'm smiling because today I was talking to my grandmother, and she was referring to somebody as them, right? So, and I was thinking, she was probably one of the early people to kind of introduce even a kind of a gender neutral grammar to talk about other people. And then you didn't know who, it was just them. And so in terms of pronouns. So she did it today in our conversation, and I thought, it was hilarious because I just remember her never calling me Keisha-Khan, by the way, always calling me Tisha. And we were laughing because she was calling the home care person by the wrong name and them. So it was, so that's how, so I thought a lot about even just how people growing up really subverted kind of gender norms, the language, English language, et cetera. And I would say that, looking back at my own family, I think all the women in my family kind of subverted what may or may not have been considered kind of gender norms, and what was expected of Black women in Jamaica and in the diaspora. I know many of people who have always questioned, for example, my mother's gender by virtue of how she acted. And so I think going in terms of in practice, looking back and thinking through some of the more recent critiques, I'm allowing kind of go back and see how women were living those practices that we now have a vocabulary for understanding or to name what we were living in Jamaica and in the United States. That said, I think it was really important that I ended up, so I should say, I went to Brazil specifically, introduced by Elisete da Silva, a historian of religion, actually, of the Baptist Church, and her husband, João Rocha, a historian of labor movements. They brought me in to their home. They encouraged me to go back to Salvador under different circumstances. That wasn't a carnival. And they allowed me to stay with them until I got settled. And I decided to go actually to take feminist studies classes at the university. So I was taking academic courses on Black feminism, not just Black, I would say Latin American feminism broadly, that included some Black feminist scholars at the Federal University of Bahia, and this is after I graduated from Georgetown. That said, I was also attending Black movement meetings where a lot of the formal organizations, there were a lot of women who participated, but there were a lot of male leaders. It turns out that one of these male leaders introduced me to some grassroots activists who were leading neighborhood struggles against land eviction and housing, and for housing, to build housing against displacement in the center of the city. So that's how I was introduced to these group of women that then introduced me to a network of housing rights activists who were mostly women throughout the city. A lot of them were domestic workers. So it allowed me to kind of reread people like Patricia Collins in a very different way, alongside other, for example, feminist scholars like Angela Figueiredo, who were writing about domestic workers in Brazil, right? So it allowed me to rethink who we thought about as knowledge producers or as feminist activists or feminist knowledge producers within the Brazilian context. And a lot of the folks I was dealing with were in some regard or another working in the informal sector and mostly domestic work. So I think for me, being in those settings allowed me also to reflect back and see how to think differently about who was actually practicing feminism in terms of immobilizing feminism in their everyday lives and social movements, as well as in their in social movements in terms of confronting the state, but also in their everyday lives. And I give you another example of, in a conversation recently, one of the activists said, what's interesting is that the movement has somewhat dwindled because, or has weakened because when they started, women had been conscripted or been understood as being mostly in the domestic sphere. So a lot of women either were working in domestic work or they were working at home, and they technically had more time to participate in the neighborhood struggle. The neighborhood struggle had so many conversations around gender empowerment in relationship to labor in terms of reproductive labor, as well as social labor to produce income, that a lot of women actually started working outside of the home, which also meant that they no longer had time to participate in neighborhood struggle. So we were talking about what that means in terms of the direct connection between political empowerment and making demands around housing, water, et cetera, and cleaning up the ocean, et cetera, and gender empowerment. But then it also had some political consequences, and how could we move forward knowing those challenges that women now face working outside the home, inside the home, but also have political obligations, right? So I would say in terms of, for me, as I'm writing, I'm always have these feminists in mind, right? So how the ideas that I'm producing impact their lives, but much, I would say, I always admit that I feel as though I grew up, I was educated in those classrooms. I spent so much time with these women to this day that I have to credit them for much of my knowledge about the critiques of the state, how gender works, how race works in Brazilian society. So I would say, for the most part, I don't always think that women who are outside of the academy are given enough credit for being our teachers, but I would say they taught me Portuguese, and, and whatever errors come up, that we always laugh, but they were my teachers in terms of writing and speaking, and the amount of letters and documents and reports I had to write and write alongside them to send to state representatives. But in terms of everyday communication, et cetera, they were my Portuguese teachers, as well as the spaces, the rare spaces in my life that I had a time to stop and reflect. When there was a protest and we would have, for example, reflections about what just happened and what we experienced, or new ideas or ideas that emerge. And I think those are who I credit for being my Black feminist teachers. And the fact that I was a Jamaican-born US Black in Brazil, having to learn another language, but also learn conceptual tools from other activists to then bring them back to the US Academy, incorporate them in my teaching, I think is really an example of how diaspora works. I mean, I remember Francia Marquez, I want to highlight her. She's a presidential candidate in Colombia. Francia Marquez, for example, came to speak at Brown, and so did another Black woman, and other Black women from the Processo de Comunidades Negras come to speak at Brown with activists from Brazil about land struggles, right? So having those, and so seeing my space and my role in kind of the, facilitating these diasporic dialogues, and how that kind of diasporic movement changed me as a person, a scholar, an activist, et cetera, I think is really important. That now impacts my students now learning Portuguese, traveling and doing this work, right? And the next generation of students and the undergraduate, graduate level who are moving forward and doing this work. I think I saw earlier Joshua Reason, one of the students at Penn. So he's part of the next generation of African-American students who are going on to do research abroad and in Brazil and learning Portuguese and facing those diasporic challenges and moving information back and forth, just like it has been done for centuries.
You detail a knowledge practice that's deeply underwritten by an ethic of collaboration, an ethic of humility, and an ethic of hospitality. You also really touched on the importance that this practice of diaspora, particularly the practice of transnational Black feminism, is one that can't be monolingual. Your own research and your work has moved across English, Spanish, and Portuguese. Can you talk to us about the importance of language in practicing, in the intellectual practice of diaspora, and the ways in which it can subvert dominant regimes of knowledge and power, particularly in the global North?
Right. I always say that if, for example, the statistics that's come out recently in Brazil, I think about 55% of Brazilians self-identify as Black or understand themselves as Black. The Brazilian population is approximately 200 million. That means it's well over 100 million. That doesn't include the Colombian population. I don't know what the statistics are there, but it's a significant Black population in places like Ecuador and Bolivia, Peru, Panama, et cetera, Nicaragua, Honduras. So I always say, Brazilians are always shocked that the Black population in the United States is so small in comparison to places like Brazil and the rest of South America. So my thing is always, and drawing from people like Robert Adams, who's written about this in terms of the importance of multilingualism, is that if we're really serious, Sheila Walker, of course, who is multilingual and definitely someone who inspired me, fluent in French, Spanish, Portuguese, and of course, English. And so I think if we're really serious about Black liberation and we don't know how to communicate with the rest of the diaspora, we're in essence reproducing empire by assuming that everyone else has to learn English. And the reality is that everyone else is trying to learn English. And if you go to Brazil, most Black Brazilians are trying to learn English in some capacity. If you go everywhere else, they're trying to learn English in some capacity. There was a guy from the Dominican Republic today, yelled out, something, and I was like, okay, you could tell that he was trying. He's like, oh, my Spanish is really, he said something like, hello, lady. I was thinking, that's like, all right. I knew he was trying, but I was saying everyone else is trying to speak English, but somehow we've maintained that English should be the status quo. So I think for me, you can't be as serious. I think you can, I shouldn't say you can't be serious. Obviously, people are serious, but I think that a true kind of diasporic in terms of African, and it also is not just these European languages. And I really wish that I could learn multiple languages. But I think for me, I've invested in Spanish and Portuguese and now French, primarily because of just the way these languages are flowing in diaspora. And if it were up to me, I think I went to South Africa, and trust me, by day 2, I was like, let me pick up a couple words. If I go to Senegal, I'm like, Nanga def, and I'm like, let me pick up a couple words because I have to figure out ways to connect. And I think it's through language. Of course, I speak Jamaican Patois, although Jamaicans say that I speak Pan-Caribbean Patois. But anyway, that all to say, I think it's so significant to have it means you're not reading people's ideas that's published in Portuguese. I remember I was on a dissertation committee and I made a comment and someone responded and saying, no, there were 900 dissertations on and master's theses on Black women or something, like some general quote. And it just made me realize that if we keep saying there's nothing on Black women, there's nothing on Black, no, there were 900, there were significant amounts of work and ideas. And I think when we were being criticized as African Americans of a certain kind of imposing our ideas on Brazil and other places, my response is to say that we were assuming that Brazilians were not producing their own ideas on Blackness. And a lot of people say, well, I really admire the fact that you cite, Afro-Brazilian authors and scholars and this, that, and the other. And I would say, it's actually the ethical thing to do. The ethical thing to do is to recognize who's come before us. And if there's a whole tradition of Afro-Brazilians who are doing this work and Brazilians in general who are doing this work, it's important that we cite them. And I cite the Luisa Barrios and, the Vilma Hayes and and the many others because they came before me. They were my teachers. I remember sitting with someone like Luisa Barrios, and before she became a minister, and she was a sociologist, Vera Benedito before, and I've learned, so much from her even before she came to Brown to speak. So I would say it's important to be able to read, engage, and I think that's part of the kind of groundings with my sister that I tried to kind of play on, is to recognize the movements that are going on around the world. I think how could we not give more attention to the fact that there's a Black woman presidential candidate in terms of hoping to represent one of the largest diasporic communities at the same time where there's no Black candidate emerging in places like Brazil. Right? So I think that's it's important, but I also think the multilingualism is an ethical, approach. It also, I come out of, studying languages and linguistics. I'm passionate about learning languages. So that's part of who I am, but I also think it's just extremely, extremely important. And if I had any advice to give students is, take advantage of language classes while in college and graduate school, because now I'm struggling to try to learn French, and French was an option for me. I could do a double major or this was a requirement for language majors at Georgetown. You could do a double major or a second language. And I chose the double major in women's studies. Yes, it would change my life. I became obviously a feminist scholar, but there are many of days where I say, wow, I wish I would have taken intensive French as an undergrad. So I would say, and it would have, the times I've been in Senegal and France and other places, and just how different my experience would have been had I spoken French in Canada. It would have, I think it's really important. But I would say it's also just, it's an important knowledge practice to be able to hear people speak in their own words, and the intonations and all of that, I think is so much more rich. You just got me excited about the language question.
I can remember these conversations.
Yeah.
And what we talked about, one of the things that I greatly regret from my time at Brown is not taking Portuguese. And I had both you and Anani holding down the fort and offering my little German. Just felt like, oh, that's out of place. Let me get Portuguese. But I want to continue this line of thinking, because you really touch on an important aspect of your research and your scholarship and your transnational politics, the politics of translation. You're actively working with scholars in Brazil, activists in Brazil, and translating manifestos, capturing their work in papers and translating them so that they can then inform knowledge practice and the production and reproduction of knowledge in the North. And that's really a truly revolutionary project. Talk to us a bit about that, your emphasis on translation and getting these ideas in circulation in and around not only your teaching and your work, but also in the Black scholar and in other scholarly venues, the importance of translation for a new vision of scholarship.
Mm-hmm. So one of the first translations I did was an open letter about police abuse in Bahia, and I actually just remembered that, as you were talking, because it was one of the activists actually in confronting the police, and I write about this in the book. In confronting the police, she died of a heart attack, and I obviously in the book I talk about how that's not normally considered police violence against women, and if we need to kind of think of a much more expansive way of thinking about how women die at the hands of the state, right? And so we wrote an open letter in Gamboa, and Ataiji Mota, who was another PhD student at the University of Texas, Austin, he helped me to publish in a venue out of Rio that was bilingual at the time. So I think that was one of the first things I tried to do in terms of getting the word out about a local movement into a national, international audience. I would say a lot of my dissertation there was so much translation work in my book. There was a lot of translation work, but one of the most important translation I did recently was with, I did I'll think about it in a second, but I did Claudia Jones, An End to the Neglect of the Negro Woman, and that from English to Portuguese. I think that was an important an important translation with Gilza Soteiro, a sociologist in Brazil. Also, we did the Combahee River Collective. That's what was on my mind, the Combahee River Collective. That was also another important essay that we translated from English to Portuguese. And I've translated works by Bell Hooks in terms of individual essays. A lot of the essays translated into Portuguese by Bell Hooks, as well as by Patricia Hill Collins, tend to be a lot of the cultural studies work. And the essays that I focused on were more, the essay around masculinity in schooling and other some of our more kind of critical race essays. So we've done some of the work in terms of translating from English to Portuguese. Now, folks like Kristen Smith have done some work. Erica Williams has done work. And I recently did an essay, a translation of a Lelia Gonzalez essay with Thais Machado, who just finished her PhD at the Universidade de Brasília. So I think there's I just did an interview with Aniele Franco that's going to come out in a NACLA report on the Americas. That's going to come out in the bilingual form. So I think part of it is making it available, because a lot of people say, well, there's nothing available in English. That's why we don't read these folks. But also just, I think part of it is there's something to be said about, I think, just the need for moving across these languages. I was, in learning more about Lelia Gonzalez in recent years, it was really impressive in terms of how she spoke French, Spanish, and just moved around the Americas and Africa and Europe. I mean, I think, and Spanish, and how much these women really made efforts to not just in terms of, communicate, but also share ideas. And I think that's partly what this transnational politics of translation is about. And that's what we discussed in the essay for the site Black Women Special Issue of Feminist Anthropology, is the need for us to start, engaging, not just citing, but also seriously taking their ideas very seriously. I mean, in terms of, you're reading, people are now, anything that happens in the United States, I feel like it happened in Brazil like recently. So I feel like we pay attention to Brazil, there's something coming down the pike in the United States. So I feel like it's really, it needs to, we think about how significant the Haitian Revolution was, for example, and how ideas were traveling around the America. It really is like that, where we have to be really invested in the sharing of ideas, and translation is a part of that work. One is learning language, but also translating the work and making it available in multiple languages, I think is important. It is very unequal right now and uneven, where it's mostly Spanish and Portuguese and French speakers who are making the effort to English. But I think that, for the most part, to have essays like the Lelia Gonzalez essay be able to be read in an Intro to Africana Studies class, and have PhD students cite the work, I think is really important.
Keisha-Khan, your work not only details and really provides a template for a robust and radical transnational politics of citation, you're also invested in creating and developing archives of scholars in the US, as well as archives for Black feminist scholars and activists in Brazil. Your recent work on the archive, setting up the framework for the archive of our dearly departed friend and just a giant intellectual in Africana studies, Anani Ngenyo. Talk to us a bit about that archival work and the ways in which your thinking around the archives informs your intellectual practice.
Right. So first of all, I mean, I feel like Anani is the gift that keeps on giving. I mean, he was so instrumental. I mean, I probably would have never gotten the job at Brown had he not been in the audience and pushing and been on the faculty and pushing for an expansion of the emphasis on Brazil and Latin America. I actually came across notes from his papers, and he wrote that I saw where he wrote that Keisha-Khan Perry's addition to the faculty has meant, an expansion of ideas on Latin America, Afro-Latin America, et cetera. I mean, to see, someone write me into their own archival papers is quite interesting. And so it made me think about, I mean, he was an archivist. I mean, he has everyone's book. If you're on this call and you've written a book, he had it in his library. And and if you've ever written anything about, Latin America, he reviewed your article for a journal. He had everything. So it made me think a lot about the importance of archives and preserving intellectual histories. Long before he passed, I had been doing work on Lelia Gonzalez, and he introduced me. And I was familiar with Teresa Santos, but he had actual papers on Teresa Santos that he had given me. So I had started to do a lot more work on intellectual histories of Black women in Latin America, and of course, deeply admired and had been influenced. And she had served in my dissertation committee. I was really interested in doing more intellectual work on Angela Gilliam. So the archival work in terms of teaching a class in archives at Brown to organize Anani's papers for the John Hay Library allowed me to kind of develop a framework for now organizing and reach, so it allowed me to kind of connect with Angela Gilliam's family. So actually a lot of the modeling for how to go about doing this allowed me to reach out to Angela Gilliam's family about not just continuing my research on Angela Gilliam, but also how to organize her papers and help to finish the memoir that she was working on. So for example, Angela Gilliam's work is intact. It's sitting exactly how, or her desk, everything is sitting exactly how she left it. So I think to have a next generation of scholars, really focus on building the Black Feminist Archives, for example. I've been submitting my own papers to the Black Feminist Archives at Brown and thinking about ways to build these histories are important. One of my anytime a student says the archives are flawed, there's nothing in the archives, there's no research to do, or whatever the excuse is, I'm like, there's so much work to be done. There's so many archival papers to be collected. For example, right now in a collaborative fashion, and it was important that you talked about the practice of diaspora being collaborative. The project that I'm working on that started off as a graphic novel with activists in terms of writing the Gamboa de Baixo history has now also turned into a massive archival project of collecting photographs, stories, interviews, papers, newspaper clippings, et cetera, for, in terms of decades of works. I think, really seeing intellectual histories and archival building archives and organizing archives as being an important diasporic work. I mean, Angela Gilliam was amazing, and she's all over Anani's archives. You can see notes and letters from the Cuban scholar, Carlos Moore, letters he wrote to Anani about citing Angela Gilliam and having interacted with her and being in Mexico together. And there's, so there's, really excavating these archives and organizing these documents, I think is really important for us as scholars. And as I wrote in an essay about collaborative research, sometimes the work is not to be interpreted, right? So sometimes the work of the activist or the collaborative scholar is to just organize it and make it available. It doesn't have to be a so-called traditional scholarly project that you have to come in and do some interpretive work, right? So perhaps part of the first phase is for you just to organize it so that family members or other researchers can access it and make it and read the work and engage the work in some sort of serious fashion, right? So I'll end there and say, yes, working with Anani's archives, he really truly was the gift that keeps on giving in terms of new ideas about how to do research and how to build knowledge or documents for the next generation of scholars, to do the work. And I'm really excited about working with Angela Gilliam's family to get that organized as well.
Well, Keisha-Khan, you've really provided us with an exemplary articulation of a critical intellectual, truly grounded intellectual practice, grounded in the knowledge of our sisters, grounded in the knowledge of diaspora, most importantly, a practice of intellectual life that is deeply collaborative, deeply hospitable, and most importantly, ethically geared toward creating a better world for all of us.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I want to end with a reading from your book and then ask you one final question.
Okay.
It's toward the end, in the conclusion of Black Women Against the Land Grab. You write, while I was completing research for this manuscript, I invited interviewees to ask me questions. They almost always asked, why I decided to focus on land rights and Black women's political activism. In addition to discussing my ongoing activist work with homeless women, I would lightly retort that all Jamaicans living abroad are deeply involved in some land dispute or another. Over the past 2 decades, my grandmother endured a fierce legal battle against land evictions in rural Jamaica that strained family relationships, as well as revising Jamaican land laws. Her victory in securing her childhood home was the direct result of the transnational efforts of my aunts, who mobilized Jamaican political support, and my mother's key role as an attorney on the legal team. My identification with land struggles came from personal experience, and my intellectual focus on these issues was an attempt to deepen these connections politically. How we transform our social conditions will depend on a diasporic view, a luta continua, and the struggle will undoubtedly continue with Black women's participation and leadership as they fight against injustice and for the right to live with dignity and freedom.
Thank you.
What is your vision for Africana studies that really can capture this beautiful and elegant statement about the diaspora that can really propel the future of dignity and with freedom?
First of all, I want to say thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this, but also just to read that to remind me about why I'm here and why I'm doing the work, because sometimes I forget some of those words that I created. So I really appreciate that. And today my grandmother said she was going to buy somebody's land next door because they were living in England. And I remember my mom saying, "You don't need any more land. leave it alone." So I thought that was interesting. But yes, I think for me, what I hope for Africana studies is a serious engagement, and I see that already. One is a serious engagement with the critical problems of our time in terms of, one, yes, looking to our past, and I think historians are so important, and literary scholars in terms of a critical imagination. But I think that also, so absolutely, they're important and doing important work for us to look to our past and to see what had been done and thought about and discussed. I remember Judy Richardson coming to speak in the Intro to Africana Studies class at Brown, and the important archive that the SNCC project has created. I mean, just important for us to continue to look backwards to see how we can move in the present and the future. And I think it's so important. And I'm hoping that a lot of what we do in Africana Studies is really focused on dealing with the critical issues of our times. I remember, reading Bell Hooks and saying, like, we teach the violence because we hope that people will be so moved, and this is her book, Teach and Transgress, would be so moved that we would, and shocked and moved by it, that we would want that our scholarship to reflect what are the critical political conditions and document the struggles that are moving forward, and that we would see our scholarship as participating in those struggles, right? So I think for me, perhaps because I came out of this background, and I would say Lennox Hines, and listening to him speak about his work with Assad Shakur and other Black movement power activists, and my mother becoming a lawyer, that I saw that becoming an academic was my way of being an advocate, that I would hope that people would see their scholarship as participating in this ongoing struggle, right? That it's knowledge that critical reflection is important in social movements, and I always emphasize that, but so is that we would think that these ideas are moving forward the struggles that are taking place right now, right? So I would say, I remember, shout out to James Pope that's on this call, that we made an effort, for example, to interview Francia Marquez, and long before, when she had just gotten the award for her environmental activism, but to document how, for example, that there would be a dissertation, a book about how a leadership comes out of the Colombian, a Black woman leadership at that highest level would come out of a place like Colombia, right? So I would say my hope is that Black studies would do a lot more of our homework in terms of homework, as well as seeing our scholarship as vitally important for propelling these movements forward, right? And not just, this, I don't exactly know what my critique would be of this moment, but there's a preoccupation with, I won't get into that right now in terms of my own critiques, but I would say my hope for Africana studies is that we would see ourselves as foot soldiers in a global struggle. Because until we realize how significant it is that there's no clean running water in a lot of our communities, and that, or that there's so much good theater, art, et cetera, that are being produced, and how people are reimagining the world, until we start to see that as part of, the good poetry, literature, as well as, the political concept tools, new vocabularies that are coming out of these struggles, as well as how people are just trying to live their lives on an everyday basis, that would be part of what we're doing in Africana studies, I think is important. And I think also honoring of the people who came before us. We don't need to be the first or the only. I think we need to, that there's no such thing as this is passe or these ideas are old. I mean, they're important. When did we stop reading certain people or engaging certain scholars? And I think teaching is so important. So is learning important as a teacher, but so is all of the critical kind of fiction and nonfiction writing taking place. So I guess so that's my hope for Africana studies, and that institutions would continue to invest in them and take them seriously, and that as scholars in Africana studies, that we'll see our work as vital to what's going on globally and not just peripheral to what's taking place. So I want to thank you so much for inviting me and these questions. And I'm glad to see some of my comrades on the call. And so thank you so much. And, Viva Africana Studies. I mean, I really think it's important. We're doing some of the most critical work today in the Academy.
Well, Keisha-Khan, I want to thank you for joining us and also providing us with such an inspiring vision of critical intellectual work that is deeply informed by the practice of community, the practice of collaboration, and most importantly, practices that connect the global African world. What you stated and also what you do provides a model for our students here at Wake Forest to begin to understand how Black studies moves across the world and connects continental and diasporic Africans across space and time. So thank you so much for joining us. We want to thank everyone who joined us this evening, and join us again on November the 7th, I believe, right, Sean? November the 7th, where we'll have another Conversations in Africana Studies, Conversations in Black Studies, and we'll feature for that conversation the professor and chair of the Corcoran Department of History, Claudrina Harrell. Thank you so much, Keisha-Khan. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Professor Walker. Thank you.
You have a great evening.
Thank you.